Welcome back to The Disturbing Real, the podcast where we dive deep into the most disturbing, controversial, and unforgettable films in cinema history. These are the movies that critics feared, censored, banned, and audiences couldn't look away from. Now, before we begin today's episode, I want to give you a fair warning. This discussion covers very disturbing subject matter, including graphic violence, sexual assault, and animal cruelty. Now, because that's central to today's film, listeners' discretion is strongly advised. With that said, let's get into it. Today we are talking about one of the most infamous films ever made, a movie that has been banned in multiple countries, dragged through court cases, accused of obscenity, and still debated over 40 years later. I'm talking about Cannibal Holocaust from 1980, directed by Ruggero Deodato. This isn't just a movie, it's a cultural event in extreme cinema. It's a lightning rod for decades about censorship, morality, exploitation, and the responsibility of filmmakers. And love it or hate it, you cannot talk about extreme cinema without Cannibal Holocaust. So in this episode, we're going to cover who Ruggero Deodato was and the Italian exploitation scene, the story of Cannibal Holocaust and its production, the release and the global controversies, the infamous censorship battles and court cases, the animal cruelty that still overshadows the film, and finally, why this movie matters, both as a cautionary tale and as a landmark in extreme cinema. So let's begin. To understand Cannibal Holocaust, you have to understand where it come from. Italy in the 1970s was a hub for genre filmmaking. Italian filmmakers made spaghetti westerns, giallo thrillers, and crime films and horror films. But one of the most profitable subgenres at the time was mondo films, documentary-style exploitation films that promised audiences shocking and taboo content from around the world. These films were usually staged, but they were marketed as authentic glimpses into exotic or brutal practices. Now, films like Mondo Cane, 1962, and Africa Adiedo, I think that's how we say it, were huge hits, and they paved the way for the cannibal subgenre. Italian filmmakers realized that the setting their stories in remote jungles gave them a perfect excuse for shocking violence, nudity, and taboo-breaking content, while also selling the idea of truth. By the late 1970s, the cannibal cycle was already underway with films like The Man from Deep River, 1972, Eaten Alive, 1980, and Last Cannibal World, 1977, by the director in question today. But none of those would compare to what Deodato was about to create with Cannibal Holocaust. So who was Ruggero Deodato? Born in 1939 in Potenza, Italy, Deodato grew up around the Italian film industry and worked as an assistant director for legends like Roberto Rossellini. But he was drawn to commercial and exploitation cinema. He had already built a reputation for pushing boundaries. In 1977, he directed Last Cannibal World, which introduced him to jungle-based shock cinema. Deodato was interested in realism, He often said he wanted his films to feel so authentic that audiences couldn't tell if what they were seeing was staged or not. This obsession with realism would later define Cannibal Holocaust, for better and for worse. The film itself has a simple but disturbing plot. An American film crew travels to the Amazon to make a documentary about indigenous tribes. When they don't return, an anthropologist is sent to find them. He recovers their film reels, which reveal the shocking truth. The crime-staged atrocities, burned villages, and brutalized the tribespeople, all for the sake of sensational footage. In the end, the tribes take revenge on the crew, and their deaths are captured on film. It's essentially a film within a film, half jungle adventure, half found footage horror. That found footage element was what makes Cannibal Holocaust groundbreaking. Remember, this was 1980, 19 years before the Blair Witch Project. Deodato created one of the first found footage horror films, blending documentary surrealism and realism with scripted horror to devastating effect. Now here's where things get complicated. Deodato wanted absolute realism, and he got it. The film was shot in the Amazon under brutal conditions, with non-professional actors mixed with locals. The actors endured dangerous stunts, grueling shoots, and very little comfort. But the most controversial decision Deodato made was to film real animal killings. Several animals were killed on camera, including a coyote, a turtle, a monkey, a pig, and a snake. These scenes were not faked, they were real, and they remain some of the hardest sequences to watch in the film. Deodato, now he defended this by saying it was normal for the tribes to kill animals for food, and he was simply capturing it. But critics and animal rights groups worldwide condemned it. Even today, many horror fans refuse to watch the film because of these sequences. The rest of the violence, rapes, mutilations, and executions were staged with special effects, but they look so real that they created an even bigger problem later on. Cannibal Holocaust premiered in Italy in 1980, and almost immediately it caused chaos. Audiences were horrified. The mix of realistic gore, real animal deaths, and pseudo-documentary style was unlike anything they had ever seen. Word spread quickly, and the film gained a reputation as one of the most shocking ever made. But the real storm came when Italian authorities seized the film just 10 days after its premiere. Deodato was arrested on charges of obscenity and murder. That's right, murder. Authorities believed the actors in the found footage segments had actually been killed on camera. The actors had signed contracts saying they would disappear from public view for a year to maintain the illusion of authenticity. Now this backfired because their absence made it look like they had been murdered for real. Deodato had to bring the actors to court to prove they were alive, and he also had to demonstrate how the special effects were achieved. One famous example, the impaled woman on a wooden stick. In court, Deodato explained she was sitting on a bicycle seat with a thin piece of balsa wood in her mouth to create the illusion. Once the court was convinced the film wasn't a snuff movie, the murder charges were dropped, but Deodato was still convicted of obscenity and animal cruelty, and the film was banned in Italy. Cannibal Holocaust went on to become one of the most censored films of all time. It was banned in multiple countries, including the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Norway, and more. In the UK, it became one of the infamous video nasties, a list of films targeted during the moral panic of the 1980s. Now, the ban's only increased its notoriety. Bootleg copies circulated among horror fans, and it developed a cult following as the most shocking movie ever made. Over time, critics began to release the film. Some saw it as exploitation garbage. Others argued it was a serious critique of Western media sensationalism, pointing out that the real monsters in the film are not the tribes, but the exploitative filmmakers who manipulate suffering for entertainment. Now that theme, the blurring of fiction and reality, and the exploitation of violence for spectacle, is what gives Cannibal Holocaust its enduring power. So why does Cannibal Holocaust matter? First, it pioneered the found footage genre. Without it, you might not have The Blair Witch Project, Paranormal Activity, or even Hostel. It showed how blending reality and fiction could make horror more unsettling. Second, it sparked global conversations about censorship. Governments were terrified of its realism, and it pushed the boundaries of what cinema could depict. Third, it remains a controversial text in film ethics. On one hand, it critiques media sensationalism. On the other, it engages in actual exploitation, especially with the animal cruelty. It's both the problem and the critique of the problem. Finally, it embodies what extreme cinema is all about: testing boundaries, provoking outrage, and forcing viewers to question their relationship with violence on screen. Whether you see it as trash or as a masterpiece, you cannot ignore it. Cannibal Holocaust is the line in the sand, the film that defines extreme cinema. So, should you watch Cannibal Holocaust? That is up to you. For some, it's essential viewing for understanding the history of extreme cinema. For others, it's simply too cruel to stomach. And both positions are valid. But one thing is certain: over 40 years later, it still has the power to shock, disturb, and spark debate. And that's why we're still talking about it today. Not to mention the soundtrack. The soundtrack is classical. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into Cannibal Holocaust. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to The Disturbing Reel for more explorations of disturbing and controversial films. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and remember, sometimes the most extreme films hold up a mirror to the darkest parts of ourselves and our culture.